This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'd like, on behalf of the Institute for the Study of the Americas, to welcome you all here this morning. Particularly pleased to be working again with the Bolivia Information Forum and the Peru Support Group, who we've collaborated with in the past, and in fact actually co-edited a volume which I think will be available if you're interested during the coffee break, entitled Evo Morales and the Movimiento al Socialismo. The Institute for the Study of the Americas role is to support and promote research on the Americas, which it does essentially by supporting events such as this, workshops, conferences, holds training sessions, and also has a publication program. Last summer we initiated a conference grant scheme for which we received 40 applications, of which one, of course, was for this conference, and we made 8 awards. The proposal for this conference really stood out. Not only was it incredibly well put together, but also it was on an issue of considerable importance and interest to both scholars and the wider public. And I think this judgment was well-founded because, of course, as you may have noticed, the conference is fully booked, although not everybody is here yet. And in fact, 40 people had registered before they even knew what the programme was. So the topic is obviously something which is of considerable interest to many people. Almost perversely, countries endowed with rich natural resources often suffer from what I expect most of you know as the resource curse. Easy to exploit, mining can have significant impacts on the environment, on the communities where it takes place, and can lead to an over-dependence upon them. So it's really important that this conference explores ways in which the real benefit from natural resources can be realised, how their detrimental impacts can be minimised, and how the resources can be managed for the longer-term benefit of economic development, in this case of Andean countries. We're exploring the way how natural resources can indeed be a blessing for all rather than a curse. The eminence of speakers today, I think, reflects the importance of these issues to Andean countries, and I'm sure that you're in for an exceptionally interesting conference. I do hope that in due course, ISA, Institute for the Study of the Americas, will be able to collaborate with the Bolivia Information Forum and the Peru Support Group in the production of papers, facsimilar volume, for the benefit of a large number of people that I know would have liked to come to this conference, because we had a huge waiting list of people who wish to attend. Unfortunately myself, I have to go out to another meeting this morning, but I hope to be able to join you for the conference later this afternoon. So welcome everybody. I'm sure, as I said, you're in for a very interesting day.
I just wanted to welcome you on behalf of the other organisers, the Peru Support Group and the Bolivia Information Forum. I'm Amy Hunton, coordinator of the Peru Support Group, and we carry out research and advocacy, working closely with a network of academia, civil society, parliamentarians in Peru and the UK and internationally in support of human rights and poverty reduction in Peru. You can find out more about our organisation in the leaflet and publications on this table over here, so please do take a copy of our latest report on informal mining and sign up to receive our newsletter so you can hear about events like this one in the future. Also, please do consider becoming a member of the Peru Support Group if you're not already. Your support is really vital to us. We're also very pleased to be selling the copies of Tony Bebbington's latest book, which is about extractive industries, conflict, and institutional dynamics in Canada. They're in Spanish and they're available for £15. We've also launched a special website to host the papers and video from this conference, as well as related resources, and we hope that it's going to become a kind of ongoing resource and space for debate. And the address for that is andean-extractives.org. We also invite you to tweet today using the hashtag extractiveandes. And we have a new Twitter account which is the same, @extractiveandes. If you'd like to use the Wi-Fi, then the password is up there on the projector. And just briefly, no fire alarms are scheduled, so if you hear one, please leave through there or through there. You can also reach the toilets in either direction. And coffee and lunch will be served during the meals. Thank you very much for coming, and I'll hand over to Tony.
I've never sat in such a big chair in my life. Well, I'd like to thank Amy and Alex for the invitation to be here, and thank all of you for coming along. What I was asked to do in this first intervention was just to try and set up some issues that might be points of reference during the day to help contextualize the day. And so what I'd like to do is just to say something around 5 different themes that may or may not be relevant for our thinking during the day. One is thinking about the purpose and context of the meeting. The second is thinking about the different positions from which people will be intervening today. Third, thinking about what extractive industries are part of, rather than thinking about them separately, but what they're part of. Fourth, we have comparisons today, so I want to just reflect a little bit on what that means to compare. And fifthly, something about one of the words that's in the title that is a tricky word, which is development. So those are my 5 points. So something about purpose and context. I know both PSG and BIF relatively well, PSG a little bit more. I have a long-standing relationship with PSG. And both are groups that don't exist to work on extractive industries, but because of the countries with which they deal, necessarily have to engage with the question of extractive industries. Whether it's because of the expansion of extractive industries affecting rights issues, or it's because of the centrality of extractive industries for the economies and politics of both countries. These are 2 organizations that have, in a sense, been captured by extractive industries. They have to say something about the topic for their mandate. But it strikes me that both organizations, like many of us, are presented with a challenge of exactly how to think about extractive industries and what to think about extractive industries, and how to get clarity on that before knowing what to advocate for. Strikes me, my first contact with, not first contact, but with the Peru Support Group a number of years ago, we did some work together on a particular mining project in North Peru, in Piura, the Majas project, also known as the Rio Blanco project, which led to a report and various debates. But it strikes me that in the final instance, it's much easier to come to a view on a particular project than it is to come to a view on extractive industries more generally. A view that can say something about the relationships between extractive industries and local society, the relationships between extractive industries and regional society, and the relationship between extractive industries and national political and economic change. That's to say something more generally about the governance of extractives as a sector. And in the same way, it's easier to think about one particular project than it is to think about the governance of extractive industries across different time horizons. Maybe it's easier to think about the short-term questions, but harder to think about the relationships between extractives in the short term, extractives in society in the short term, in the medium term, and in the long term. And we have one presentation, Rosemary's presentation today, which will place those questions of time and history very much at the center of our discussion. But there's a challenge to think about the governance of extractives over time, linking short-term, medium-term, and long-term, where the long-term is, it's not just a term in which, to use Keynes's quip, we're all dead in the long term. But in this particular instance, with the recent, not just recent, but accumulating evidence on climate change, it may well be the case that there are a good number of people who are not alive in the long term because of climate change. And so thinking about those short-term, medium-term, long-term relationships are really difficult but important in the context of this meeting. So part of the rationale is that how and why, how to think about extractives and what to think about extractives. And it's not an easy discussion. It takes us much further than activism around particular projects. One of the key in the title, the key term that the organisers have linked that reflection around is the term alternatives, alternative strategies. So I think I also want to reflect a little bit on what that means. When we say alternative, what are we actually referring to? I don't think there's a single answer there, but it's something we should bear in mind during the day. Is it a question? Is the idea here to think about alternatives to current strategies? It seems to me that's a very legitimate question to have when, in a context such as contemporary Peru, there are so many large projects that are stalled because of the nature of social conflict around extractive industries, particularly around mining. But there is a legitimate question to ask whether there should be alternatives to the current arrangements for the governance of extraction. And in that sense, having Hugh here to talk about Quellaveco, I think was maybe particularly helpful for thinking about that dimension of alternatives. Alternatives to recent business as usual. But there is the devil's in the details. What would those alternatives to business as usual involve? To what degree would they involve free, prior, and informed consent? To what degree would they involve land use planning and economic zoning? To what degree would they involve different ways of managing rents? So this alternative to current situation, to business as usual. But alternatives might also mean thinking about a suite of alternatives, among which choices would be made. But that also begs the question as to what would be the process for defining those different alternatives. What would be the relationships between expert knowledge and lay knowledge, constitutional knowledge, in elaborating those alternatives? And who ultimately would be in the business of choosing among alternatives? And once choices were made, those actors whose alternatives were not accepted as the alternatives to follow, would they be happy to live with that situation? So there's also a question about alternatives as a suite of options that raises issues more generally to do with democracy and political representation. Third, I think it's worth bearing in mind whether no is an alternative. I think one can recently argue that in the short and medium terms, given the centrality of the extractive economy to Bolivia and Peru, no in a general sense is not a viable alternative. But that leaves open the possibility that specific nodes, projects in certain areas, might be part of an alternative strategy. And then again, there's a question of time. Thinking about the relationships between alternatives in the short term, the medium term, and long term, and relationships between those phases that would allow a viable sequencing of alternatives. So just a few, that's longer thoughts, just a few more shorter reflections. One is about, so the second reflection, more specific one is about the positions from which people will be speaking today. We have as Linda was saying, these panelistas it's un lujo to have this set of panelists here. But they come in with different concerns and different agendas. They're coming having had very different sorts of engagements with the question of extractives. They've had engagements as workers, they've had engagements as owners, they've had engagements as regulators, they've had engagements as activists, they've had engagements as researchers. And that diversity is an asset. It's a great thing to work with during the day. But it comes with a risk. It comes with the risk that we could end up, at the end of the day, having largely talked past each other because we've meant different things by the same term, or because we've not really explored more explicitly the larger agendas that underlie specific positions vis-a-vis the question of extractives. So there's a challenge here about having debate, I think. There's a challenge about having a really serious debate about some of the issues at stake, rather than just playing with having dialogue. And I think, and I say that with personal experiences in mind. It strikes me that the word dialogue is used a lot around questions of extractive industries. But it strikes me that oftentimes those dialogues are really about playing and having dialogue, rather than having a serious, substantive debate about the relationship between the larger and the specific issues that are at stake. And there are some larger issues at stake. So if you look at the background paper, the background document that Bev put together with the 5 essays that people, short essays that people wrote, is on the table outside. You can see that the different authors are thinking about extractives in relationships to something else. At the larger scale, they're thinking about extractives in relationship to projects of national liberation, They're thinking about extractives in relationship to what you might call sustainability transitions, rather than sustainability. They're thinking about extractives in relationship to territorial and subnational development. They're thinking about extractives in relationship to democratization. It's a slightly more specific scale, but still it's a larger issue. They're thinking about extractives in relationship to business strategy, to corporate strategy, or about extractives in relationship to civil society organization strategy. And I think that's important to bear in mind, that the issue, as in many debates, the question that confronts this is extractives in relationship to something else. But that's usually what people are talking about. They're not just talking about a mine, or a well, or a pipeline. They're talking about that in relationship to something larger. And it's important for us during the day, I think, to work those two things at the same time. Something about comparisons and something about development. We have on our agenda Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador today. So the day's been set up as comparison. And I think it's important and legitimate to ask why. Why compare? And to ask what's potentially lost and what's potentially gained by comparing. One argument might be that these 3 countries over the last 5 to 8 years have been 3 very different sorts of political regime. And therefore, it's interesting to compare what's happening to extractives across those 3 regimes. A few years ago, in the NACLA report, I wrote an essay suggesting that while there are clearly differences in what's in the governance of extraction in those 3 regimes, there were some intriguing similarities. All 3 regimes were promoting the expansion of the extractive economy. All 3 regimes were tending to criticize and delegitimize critics of extraction. All 3 regimes were tending to, and I think still tend to, prioritize national agendas over local agendas and subnational agendas. And all 3 regimes were showing certain tendencies towards the authoritarian management of the question of extractives. So I think it's interesting to ask in what ways these 3 countries are handling extractive questions similarly and in ways that are different. And how the circumstances of each of these countries affects the particular ways in which they're handling extractives, and how those circumstances affect what will ultimately be a viable alternative and not a viable alternative. Because I think while it's valuable to compare, it's also important to recognize the context dependence of what alternatives stand the chance. And finally, a reflection on development. We have development in the title of the day. I consider myself a development geographer. By the way, Linda is a geographer also, so it's very nice to start today with two geographers up here. But I also know that the word, and one of the lessons from critical development studies over the past 2 decades now, is that the term development can be used for all sorts of different political projects, for all sorts of different projects in general. And I think that's the case in the extractive industries debate as well. Whether it's proponents of extractive industries endorsing the sector on the grounds that it's one of the only, if not the only option for development in very remote, high altitude, oftentimes the term's used, primitive environments. So there's one mobilization of the term development. Other times the term is used to question critics of extractive industries on the ground that they're being anti-developmental. And thirdly, the term's often used by critics of development when they're criticizing governments and corporations for being developmentalist. The basic point being that the word development is used by different players in these debates to try and position the other and to try and categorize them in a way that tries to undermine the validity of their arguments, whether they're corporations, governments, or civil society players. And so I want to suggest that as we talk today, we do the best that we can to try and avoid using the word development. And actually try and be as specific as we can be about what it is we want to say, or what it is we're trying to get at. And also because our sessions go by the titles of spread effects, impact management, depletion of resources, policy options. They go by terms that relate to development. But if you look at some of the themes in the background papers that people are talking about, they're talking about free, prior, and informed consent. They're talking about national liberation, the first paper. They're talking about redistributive social spending. They're talking about the relationship between centre and region. Ultimately, they're talking about questions to do with democracy as much as to do with development. And so it seems to me, or at least I want to suggest that while our title is development, what we're also talking about today is something that's really deeply political. But political in the very good sense of the term. This is a debate about what really matters. It's a debate about how to get there. And it's a debate about what can be traded off in that process of getting there, and what absolutely should not be traded off in that process of getting there. So those are my opening thoughts that might be points of reference as the discussions unfold during the day.